Good morning, guys. Welcome back to another week of devotions, working our way through the second half of the book of Mark. This morning we're still in chapter 10, picking up from verse 35, where two of Jesus' disciples, James and John, come to him with a request. They say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." It's like someone coming up to you and say, "Hey man, can you do me a favor?" And you're left saying, "Well, it depends what the favor is before I tell you whether I'm going to do it or not." And Jesus replies similarly, "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They said, "Well, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left when you come into glory." Bit of a strange request at face value, but here are these disciples traveling around Jesus, full of messianic expectation that this Jesus would be the one to re-establish Israel as the superpower of the known world. And yes, he's on his way to Jerusalem, but they haven't picked up on the message that he's going there to die, to give his life. They're just assuming that he's going to retake power and ascend to the throne. And here's one of them wanting to be on his right and the other wanting to be on his left when he comes into power. And Jesus more or less goes, boys, you're still not getting it. Can you drink the cup that I'm about to drink and undergo the baptism that I'm about to undergo? And he's basically referring to his suffering and his death. And when the other 10 hear about James and John's request, they were indignant. Their noses were put out of joint. They didn't like the fact that they beat them to it. They were hoping that those places were reserved for them. Jesus calls them all together and uses this as a teaching moment. And he says these very famous words, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, in my kingdom, boys, it's not about who's going to be first or who's going to be top dog. It's actually who's going to be the least, who is going to be the greatest servant, who's going to come from underneath to lift other people up. That was the example that Jesus was setting for his disciples, and it's also what he calls his disciples to model to one another. Man tends to look for promotion, but Jesus was exercising devotion. Man tends to look for how he will be served, but Jesus was giving an example of how he would serve, and he calls his followers to follow that same example.